Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Josh Rothes. I think most of you know me. I'm the editor, publisher, webmaster of Sublunary Editions, and we are here today to celebrate the release of our translation of Bruno Schultz's Undula with translator Frank Garrett, who, at least on my screen, is in the upper left. Frank is a writer and translator, obviously, who lives in Dallas, Texas. He has a PhD in philosophy and literary theory, as well as an advanced certification in Polish philology from the Catholic University in Lublin. Did I get that right, Frank?
Sure.
Excellent. Frank has promised to correct my pronunciation throughout this event. And of course, Bruno Schultz, I think everyone's probably a little familiar with. Schultz was born in 1892 in Drogovic, which during his lifetime was, I believe, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, part of Second Polish Republic, and occupied Nazi Germany. Schultz produced two collections during the course of his life. In 1934's either the Cinnamon Shops or the Street of Crocodiles, depending on where you are, in 1937's Sanitarium Under the Hourglass, as well as assorted criticism, essays, etc., most of which are unfortunately lost to history. And he died in 1942, being shot by a Gestapo officer on his way back to the ghetto with a loaf of bread. So unfortunately, due to the circumstances that Schultz lived in, much has been lost. So that's why, including a full-length manuscript, The Messiah, long sought, never found. So this was quite a find. What's perhaps most interesting about Undula as a piece is that it dates from 1922. It was published in 1922 pseudonymously by Schultz in a journal called Dawn, which was aimed at local petroleum officials. Not only was it published 12 years before Cinnamon Shops came out, I think most interestingly, no one was really sure he was even writing at this stage in his life. I mentioned to Frank that I was rereading Jerzy Fikowski's foreword to his Letters and Sketches collection that came out in English. And in it, Fikowski, who is very much, I would venture to say, a Max Brod type character, very concerned with making sure Schultz's legacy lived on. He ventured that the earliest he thought Schultz would have started writing is 1924. So this not only is 12 years before Cinnamon Shops, but it's years before anyone even thought he was writing. Frank, what can you tell us about kind of what was going on both in the world and in Schultz's life at this time?
So at the time, Galicia, this region that's now currently spanning Western Poland, Eastern Ukraine, was the oil production capital of the world. And so there were lots of oil derricks probably within view of him walking around his town, which is in the northern Carpathian Mountains in that region. And that's sort of the fortunate aspect of the industry that was dominant at the time there, because this literary journal where he published, you're saying, how are you saying that the title, Undula?
I went with just Dawn. I went with the English.
No, the title of the short story.
Undula? Is that?
Undula? Okay, so you're stressing the first syllable. I've been stressing the second syllable, and that's primarily because in Polish, the next to the last syllable is typically the one that's stressed, but in English, we can decide how to say it. It's not a typical Polish name by any means. But anyway, thanks to the industry that was dominant at the time, the oil industry of Galicia, Bruno's older brother worked for and worked in the oil industry. And so there was some sort of connection there. And this literary journal where Undula was published first was designed specifically for the officials in the oil industry there. And so it's kind of interesting to have this strange little, very niche market for oil executives having their own literary publication at the time, which isn't too out of the ordinary for that time period 100 years ago. I think you'd be hard pressed to find oil execs having their own literary journal or literary press at this time.
So this being his, as far as we know, his literary debut, I mean, certainly I think since the discovery of this story, there's probably a new branch of Polish literary academics combing through any and all publications for additional stories. Was that freeing to you as a translator, knowing it came early?
Oh, absolutely. I felt very good about not bothering doing the kind of literary research that I would do otherwise. I translated a memoir from Polish a few years ago, and the author was raised Jehovah's Witness, and I did weeks, if not months, worth of research, digging out archival resources from local religious libraries in my area, just to understand what he was talking about and the kind of language he would have used, especially when referring to religious doctrine. And so for this story, because it seems already so disconnected from the rest of his writing that came later, and just the way that it was found just a few months ago, I felt very good about not doing any research, not even really looking up too much biographical information, and just dive in, see what the language was there, because I felt fairly certain that if it did have anything to do with what came later with his writing or his biography, then it would be there. It would be there to discover in the Polish and in the translation process. And so it was like you said, it was freeing to be able to just dive in with the language and start translating right away without trying to understand too much of the context.
What's really remarkable, when you brought this idea to me, anytime I hear, newly attributed, since it was published pseudonymously, there's immediately a question of, well, I think, I guess maybe of the field of Shakespeare studies, like, well, how convincing is it? And then you read, as soon as I got your translation, which is one of the most exciting emails I think I've opened in a long time, it's so unmistakably Schultz. You get, I think on page 6, you get the first appearance of Adela, who is a figure that resurfaces quite a bit, I believe, in Sanitarium or the Hourglass. You see a lot of his familiar fixations. You get, of course, Undula herself. Who is she, at least in terms of within his world and his work, especially in the graphic arts?
Well, she seems to be a type of muse figure for Schultz, as far as I can tell, and as far as I've been able to do the research. But of course, the research is ongoing because, like I said, this story was only just discovered. I think I first learned about it maybe in May, and it had just been announced that they had published this found document in a Polish journal at the time. So so there's not anybody that it's based on that we know of. She seems to be some type of composite figure, and I make the argument, and I think it's a very sort of easy argument to make, that she, to a large extent, is based on the main character from Sasur Masak's Venus in Furs. So Vanda von Dunayev, who is the archetype I guess she's a sadist, but her partner is the masochist, and she's this dominant woman who, if you read Venus in Furs, there's all these other references to Venus, of course, because this is her Russian or Slavic incarnation, but she's from the north, so she's wrapped in furs as opposed to being, in gauzy lace and like our typical portrayal of the Greek gods. But also she has a lot of connection, a lot of similarity with Tsarina Catherine the Great, who is also seen as this dominant woman, also always draped in furs just because of the climate. And so there's all these kind of interesting, at least literary connections. Like I said, I don't know if anybody is really trying to figure out if she's based on a particular woman in Schultz's life.
I've always read her as you said, a composite character, maybe a projection of certainly his fascination with seemingly being dominated by a female. She appears, I think you mentioned her afterward, in a bunch of sketches that he did around this time that were, I believe, supposed to be, I think it's usually agreed upon that they were supposed to be for an illustrated version of Venus in Furs. They were published on their own as the Book of Idolatry. I think it's the most common.
Right. The name had been used before by Schultz in his artwork. Schultz often, especially at this time in his life in the early 20s, was really trying to decide what he wanted his creative outlook or creative vocation to be. He was very much trained as a visual artist, and he did a lot of sketches, a lot of drawings. I'm not sure he did so many paintings, but he was really sort of innovative in this technique that's almost like at the time would have been like an archaic form of photography, where you're using these plates and doing kind of prints based on photographic technology. And so he's primarily, at least now, known as this type of artist, and that's his main contribution to art. But he was also, like we know now, writing short stories as well. And of course, he sort of becomes famous much later for his literary output. But he had used this name Undula, or as the name for this dominant woman in the artwork.
I'm curious, especially since you just said that even his artistic style at the time was maybe a bit archaic. What did you notice about the language when you first got in here? I know, you mentioned translating it to kind of a higher register. Was the language he was writing in characteristic of what would have been seen, especially around the Polish avant-garde at the time?
There was nothing particularly avant-garde about his language, although so since I've published, since I've translated this piece, I have of course gone back and done all the literary research I would have done before translation. So I've read the complete works of Bruno Schultz and read through a lot of his letters and looked at his artwork and done that kind of research. And his use of language is so distinctive and so idiosyncratic that, like you said earlier, it's impossible to to doubt that Schultz wrote this story, because the language is there. And this, it's been decades since I'd last read Schultz. So I was really operating on a blank slate, because I didn't have much memory of having read his stories before. But once you read just a couple of stories, like I started the collected stories translated most recently by Madeline Levine, and she translated all of the stories. I think it came out in 2016, maybe, just a few years ago. But in the very first story, he recycles his language and he recycles his themes, so much so, like the description of the winter in Undula, and how it's this fortress of blackness and nothingness, and it's created this walled in sort of consciousness and has a life of its own. He uses the exact same language to talk about the spring. And instead of this blackness and this nothingness for the spring, it's this goldness, the goldness of the sun, the goldness of the flowers, and is basically being walled in by this color that comes alive and sort of envelops every aspect of his life. And so there's something very distinctive about his language. I mean, everything is repeated. The character's name, Adela, the cockroaches appear in everything. Even the word polyp. I counted the word polyp at least maybe 5 times reading the collected works. And that is, the candelabra is described as a polyp hanging from the ceiling. And so there, like, even the most basic sort of words and vocabulary, he's constantly reinventing, refreshing, reusing, and recycling.
What was the experience like for you as you started to reread his works after doing the translation and encountering some of those familiar turns of phrase and characters and themes as you went back through his back catalog?
It was really interesting for me to read his later work after, so to speak, the earliest work that we know of, because it's been 18 years since I lived in Poland and since I spoke Polish regularly. So I don't think in Poland. I don't have much use in my day-to-day life with the language, but reading Levine's translation, it's almost like my brain was recreating the Polish, because I had dealt with the Polish so intensely with my translation that it sort of kind of reactivated this use of the language and this familiarity with the language. So like, I could read a sentence in Levine's translation and I feel like I could sense what the Polish was originally. I haven't gone to look at the Polish text to see how correct I was, but that was sort of an interesting experience, because that's something that I haven't really experienced before with language.
No, that's very interesting. I'm curious if you have any sense of, so Schultz himself was trilingual, I believe. He spoke Yiddish, Polish, and German quite fluently, and some of his bigger literary influences, from Thomas Mann to Kafka, of course. I believe he wrote an introduction to the first Polish edition of The Trial. And Rilke were big for him. He's an interesting figure with being, I think maybe it's my Americanness that thinks trilingualism is a little odd, but he wasn't writing in Yiddish like Isaac Bashevis Singer was at the time. and he was both sort of cosmopolitan, but also never really, I think he, would visit Warsaw and they made it to Paris, but lived in his hometown for pretty much his entire life. How do you think those two aspects of his character interplay and inform his language?
Well, I think, and this goes back to an earlier question you had asked about his language. He seems to be very much in the same way that he was trying to decide between being a visual artist or a literary artist. I think he was also quite torn, maybe, between trying to be more cosmopolitan and trying and sort of resigning himself to living his life out in the provinces, as it were. And I think there's definitely a tension there. Most likely because of where he lived, he was probably at least somewhat functional in Ukrainian as well, possibly even Russian to some extent. German would have been the official language, at least from the time that he was born. And so he probably probably German was his strongest second language after Polish. And I read a couple of things. I can't remember if it was Fikowski or someone else, basically criticizing his knowledge of Yiddish. So I don't know how good his Yiddish was, his Hebrew, but so I think that also tied into the way that I translated, because I knew that he spent so much time in his hometown, the home of his birth, for 50 years with almost limited excursions outside, that I felt like some of his language was a throwback to an earlier, if not actually semantically and lexically, then at least sort of culturally, that he's referring to or sort of experiencing life through a language that's a little bit slightly more archaic, or not the cosmopolitan worldliness that he would have experienced in a place like Lviv or in Vienna or Paris or even Warsaw at the time. And so that also influenced my writing, my translation, in that I resorted to a little bit of sort of fancy archaic things in English as well, that even if they weren't necessarily in the Polish, I felt like the mood of the text and the themes of the text were definitely informed by something in literature happening earlier. And in my essay, I write about how it seems like he's writing something between Edgar Allan Poe and Huysmans. And so I kind of placed him, at least in my own mind, in English as using that kind of language. That sort of late Romanticism tinged by Gothic and symbolism and decadence as well.
So one of the most striking aspects of this story is it's risque, I think, for one, the time, and it's even risque for Schultz, who the undercurrent of sadomasochism is pretty present in his work. There's an erotic undercurrent in a lot of it, but it seems, I wouldn't say it's blatant here, but it's maybe a little bit more pronounced. How did you go about kind of dealing with some of that language, and what was your sense of him writing this? How much was he, is the innuendo a literary device, or a device for maybe escaping obvious censorship. What do you know about that? And there's one scene I know you're keen to talk about, so now's the time.
The demonic blowjob scene.
Yes.
Well, I mean, in the Polish, there was I don't even know how to begin this conversation. I mean, there weren't any dirty words per se, but I mean, there's definitely lots of things going on. And I mean, the demonic blowjob scene was curiously enough the most difficult sentence in the entire piece to translate. It was the one I was working on even after the deadline I gave myself, even after the deadline of I sent you multiple, this is the final edit versions, and then I would email you one more time saying, let's change this sentence one more time. And so, I mean, it's something I definitely thought about, it's something I talked about as much as I could with whoever could help me either in Polish or in English to figure out how to navigate that. Because, I mean, she's putting something in her mouth. The Polish word is członki, so it means members, like the member of a political party, the member of your family. But of course, in slang, it means penis. And he uses this word, but the sentence linguistically is such a mess because there's no subject, and that's not all that interesting because Polish, there's lots of implied subjects, but even the implied subject of the sentence seemed to be missing. And so much of the grammar, it wasn't easily clear what function the sentence, the actual words had in the sentence. So you know, there's a lot going on here, and then there's just also grammatical mistakes. I am very particular and anal retentive when it comes to grammar, especially something like Polish that has lots of grammatical cases. And, you know, I spent a lot of money and a lot of time learning this language. And so I feel like I understand the grammar probably better than the actual words that are in the sentence most times. And so grammatically, it's a mess. There are just mistakes. I don't know if they were editing mistakes when it was published in the journal, or if they were mistakes that Bruno left in and just sort of ended up in the journal. So there was a lot going on, but then trying to figure out how to translate this this word that means members, and I settled on appendage because it was. I don't think he was using it like, you know, she's sucking their dicks. I don't think it was that sort of slangy. And like I said, everything is implied and everything is garbled. So to some extent, you can't even tell what, like I said, what the subject is or who's sucking what or what is being sucked. And none of the personal pronouns worked because they were all wrong. Like he would use like the wrong case, like for the direct object. Instead of using me, he would use something like mine, but not like implying something that came before what that mine would have been. And so it was, yeah, it was good times.
Do you actually want to read a bit maybe from that section, like starting from the break at the bottom of page 7? The people are asking for it.
We have to give the people what they want. I'm sorry I'm missing what's going on in the chat, but it seems it must be good. How hard it is to breathe in a room caught in the grip of a wintry night. Through the walls and roof, one feels the dark pressure of 1,000 starless skies. The air is sterile. It hurts my lungs. Even the lamp's flame is overgrown with black mold. The pulse grows weak, shallow, TD. Someplace deep in the solid mass of night, people, unaccompanied save for their lanterns, make their way down winter's black corridors. It seems like their desperate conversations, their indifferent, monotonous gossip comes flying at me. Angela lies resting in her sweet-smelling bed in the embrace of a heavy dream that sucks out from her the memory of all the orgies, of all her follies. With her limp, supple body, unswathed from the constraints of gauze, lingerie, and stockings, she brought darkness to its knees like a great ursine beast wrapped in fur, clutching it in her four enormous paws, gathering to her its creamy silken appendages into one sweet, yielding handful that she laps up with her scarlet tongue. But she is callous, with eyes far off in dreams. She surrenders, helpless, to feed upon the darkness, and through her rosy veins flow the milky ways of stars, her eyes drunk on these dizzying carnival nights. Angela, Angela, thou sighing of the soul into the land of the happy and the beautiful, how my soul has expanded with your radiance, while I stood a lowly, pitiable Lazarus before your luminous threshold. Through you, in the warm shiver of pleasure, I've come to know my misery and ugliness in the light of your perfection. How sweet it was to read from a single glance the verdict condemning me forevermore. With the most profound humility to submit to the flick of your hand that cast me from your banquet tables. I would have doubted your perfection should you have done otherwise. Now it's time for me to return to the threshing floor from which I had only left an impetuous miscarriage. I shall follow through to the end so as to atone for being my maker's mistake. Angela, Angela, lucid dream of yon land, before long even I will forsake you. The final darkness draws near, so too the agony of the threshing floor.
I love that.
Woo!
Steamy in here. Open a window. What's interesting is Frank, I hope you don't mind my sharing this, but I texted Frank probably half an hour before this meeting, and I was rereading the story, and there's a bit at the end where he is sort of describing a homuncular figure that is maybe the manifestation of his, shall we say, twisted desires. And I texted Frank, am I wrong in reading the homunculus bit as him talking about his junk? Frank's like, I hadn't thought of that, but now that you say it, yes. So there, I mean, the undercurrents.
And of course, I've been thinking about this for the past 30 minutes or an hour now, but I like the interpretation a lot because there's some really weird things if you think about that he's talking about his penis as opposed to his pain that is manifested as this homunculus. But at the end, he's talking about the wind that's going to liberate him and free him from his isolation, from his almost enslavement in this place, is tempting him to leave his pain there, to leave his little homunculus. And so there's a lot of things happening there with this new reading.
Yes, it is. I carefully tuck him under the duvet. Yes. I've got a few more questions, but I wanted to open it up for others. Feel free to either maybe unmute or even just put your questions in the chat room. Anyone?
I have a question.
Sure.
Frank, you know, as much as your translation, I absolutely love your afterword. I think that this should become a model. In fact, I'm going to show it to my translation students as a model for a translator's note. But I'm wondering why it was an afterword and not a foreword.
That was left entirely up to my publisher and editor. I didn't really have any thought, and I do think that Schultz's words are the most important thing, and I'm very happy to play second fiddle to Bruno Schultz. You know, it's just an honor to have my name on the same book as his. So yeah, I mean, that was sort of Josh's call, I think. Josh, do you have any memory of why you decided for an afterword as opposed to a forward?
I don't know that it was a terribly conscious decision. I think given, and I don't mean this by any stretch of the imagination in a negative way, the fact that it was more, you know, mechanical, like there was some context of what was going on in the world, a bit about Schultz, a bit about the discovery, but I think when you get more into the mechanics of the translation, some of the choices you made, those things I tend to prefer to put towards the end. I didn't think, you know, Schultz, the story, and also being such a short volume of, you know, you don't want to get halfway through the volume and then realize that's, you're just starting the story now. But yeah, I don't think it was an overly conscious decision. I think we've got kind of things coming out in the next few months that are sometimes one, sometimes the other. But I thought a lot about, like, and George, maybe another good model for your students, some of like Lisa Dillman's that were afterwards for the Yuri Herrera books that she's done recently. That's kind of what came to mind.
Love Lisa.
And of course your own. I enjoying the Alberto Chimal.
Oh yeah, Josh was on that Zoom meeting with Alberto.
I remember.
So Natalie in the chat asked a question, and I cut and pasted that sentence. I don't think I could remember it, or I probably had it memorized at some point over the summer because I thought about it so much. And here was one of the last attempts to try to diagram the sentence and figure out what the hell is going on with this language. And I mean, there's, yeah, like every word I have, okay, this is nominative, this is an adjective, this is a noun, this is the accusative case, this is a mistake, it should be yong and not ye. And is this feminine pronoun referring to undula or to the ciemność, which is darkness, which is a feminine noun in Polish? So there's a lot going there.
I tend not to give people easy translation assignments. I see Jessica smiling. Natalie, how do you do?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many resonances in this sentence. She took the darkness like a giant furry bear underneath her. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time on the prepositions in the translation because, I mean, she's putting darkness beneath her, and my translation I used, she brought darkness to its knees, because I wanted her to be the dominant one, and to sort of recreate the positionality of what's going on. But yeah,
Fantastic. Thank you.
sure.
Frank, something I remember you telling me as we were discussing the myriad choices that get made in the course of even something brief like this, as you talked about this one sentence in particular. Something I like that you said is that you I think the term you used was cafe au lait translator. I'm curious if you could explain that to the crowd.
This was probably my very first, one of the first graduate courses I took. So it was mid-90s maybe. And it wasn't even a translation course, but it was with a translation scholar, Bruno Schultz, who at least George knows, maybe some of you know through Alta. He was one of the co-founders of Alta. But he's, so he teaches like the basic intro to methodology graduate class at the University of Texas at Dallas. And one of the assignments that we could do was to write an essay about comparing multiple translations. And I had just read a translation of Camus' The Stranger, and so I got another translation, which was easy to find, and wrote an essay. That was my first, one of my first graduate school assignments, and comparing the translations. And on the very first sentence, the very first page rather, one translator has cafe au lait, and the other translator has coffee with milk. And I thought it was utterly ridiculous. I spent most of the essay basically complaining about the translator who actually did this sort of inane thing of translating cafe au lait to coffee with milk, and how that doesn't convey any sort of cultural awareness of English or the efficacy or importance of even the slightest French term in English, and how that sort of erased the kind of Frenchness of the novel itself. And so since that time, I've especially when reading multiple translations, I sort of assign, okay, this is the coffee with milk translation, and this is the cafe au lait translation. The one that, are you trying to be culturally aware and sensitive to the nuance of language and how that resonates in another language? Or are you just replacing one word in one language with another word in another language and not doing that sort of literary work that translation is, or can be, or should be?
Dwight in the chat mentions it in Madeline Levine's translator's note. She mentions, I'm not going to attempt the name, in the previous translations, that they seem to seek visual images and bizarre events, whereas Levine wanted to focus on conveying the linguistic tics and mannerisms of Schultz. Did you find that an either or choice, or difficult to convey both at the same time?
I didn't really find that to be a difficult choice. I didn't think that I had to choose one over the other. The bizarre visual images are right there in his idiosyncratic use of language. And I mean, like the one sentence that we just talked about, the blowjob scene, the language is garbled and the scene is already hazy, and you don't know what's going on, and you don't know where this person is, and you don't know who these people are. But still, there's something happening there. Something is occurring. And there's, like I said, specifically, there's some sort of positionality. So you can visualize, okay, she is above whatever she's above, and how what is the language that Schultz uses to establish that scene, and then how can I recreate it without resorting to coffee with milk kind of metaphors, but sort of recreate it in English that has its own sort of literary qualities, and then my own sort of idiosyncratic, because I think my own translation is very idiosyncratic sometimes, and I'm fine with that, because I think, and I've been trained to think that translation is a literary art as much as creating an original work of fiction, and so it's my language, so I can sort of do with it what I want because it's mine. But still, remaining true to what Schultz is doing with his own idiosyncratic language. So no either or. It was difficult to translate him, period. It didn't matter if I would have tried to focus on just the visual images or just the sort of linguistic quirks. Christina, yeah, definitely. I mean, there is in the Polish, and I hope in the English to some extent, the sort of undecidability as to what the action is, what's going on, who's doing what, and is it something that is on display for him, or is it something in his fantasy that he's just fantasizing about or dreaming about, or is it a memory for him? I mean, all of those aspects are wrapped up in this whole story, and so I think that it can certainly be read that way.
I think it's George's comment.
Is there any other logocentrism? That's the fallow.
We're just going straight innuendo in the chat now. What's interesting, I think, in either of those interpretations is they're both, backed up in some way by the visual accompaniments, the images that were done for the Book of Idolatry. The one for the cover, which I have right here, clearly shows the woman as taller. So she is, even though he is not physically on his knees, she is dominating him physically. And then many of the images to support Christina's reading seem to usually be Angela, perhaps clothed, perhaps not, in a supine position on maybe a fainting couch with a man or men at her feet, kind of looking up at her lovingly. Did the images come into play at all in your rendering of this, Frank, or was that kind of consigned to the other bin of I'll do this after I translate and revisit those?
I can't remember looking at the images. I probably did, but if I did, I wasn't consciously deciding that this had really much anything to do with this particular story. I had read a couple of articles in Polish, I think from like some of the literary sites that publish sort of culture in Poland kinds of articles, just about Bruno Schulz in general and the connection with between or among him and Kafka and Zasar Masach. And so so I was probably thinking about the constellation of him, Kafka, and the Venus and Furs novel, but not really any of his artwork. I wasn't like trying to pattern descriptions of her based on the artwork or anything like that. That just didn't come into play for me.
Do we have any other questions? I've got one more I wanted to ask, but happy to let someone else join in.
I had a question, and actually I might have emailed it to you earlier, but I'm wondering about the journal that this was published in. I mean, it seems from the title, it seems like such a strange venue for this, such a strange home for this type of story. So I'm curious if we know more about the background of this journal. Were there other types of fiction that were like anywhere in the range of what this is?
Oh yeah, you can find the entire journal online, a PDF of it, at the archive in Lviv. If you go to their website, I think even at the back of the book, if like that website should take you at the very back. There's the sort of photocopy of the actual Polish text. That I think will take you to the archive, and I mean it's a full-blown literary journal for the oil execs. So right across from this, the beginning of the short story is a poem. There's reviews of artwork, which is how the person found it in the first place, because she was looking for this Ukrainian scholar, Lesia Homich, was looking for reviews of art shows that Bruno Schultz had shown some of his work from the Book of Idolatry. And so she was just randomly going through these things and stumbles upon this short story with this name that, of course, is used in the Book of Idolatry. And then, you read the first sentence and it sounds like Bruno Schultz.
Immediately, yeah. Great, thanks.
At one point early on, we were considering actually translating the name. What was kind of, I know you and I went back and forth on it. What was your thought process there, and how did that evolve as we went along?
I mean, it's such an inelegant name, I think. Undula, I hate the English. I hate it in Polish, Undula. It just sounds sort of inelegant. And so I thought about maybe using like a French translation. I came up with Undulé, like Ondelet, basically. But that sounded too much like Undulé in Spanish. And then I sort of came up with Olita in Spanish, which also means little wave. And so for the longest time, it probably wasn't until like the last couple of final edits or final proofs that I had sent you that I actually changed the name back, just because the sheer overwhelming inertia of this is how this person is known in Polish. It's related to the artwork. This is the name that it uses, Undula walking, or the procession with Undula. So Undula at night. So there's too many things to fight against to try to make the name more pleasing to my ears.
Well, guys, we're coming up on the hour mark. Thank you, everyone who attended. This was really great. This is an excellent conversation. It's great not only to celebrate the release of this book, Frank's amazing work translating it, but it's always a good day to celebrate Bruno Schultz. I think for both of us, probably making us spend more time with his work and really getting to know him in a way that I haven't before, and just reading through his works was a real pleasure. I hope they find more. And if they do, Frank, I hope you're up for it.
So, you know, as soon as this was found and published, then all the Polish scholars started digging through archives, and then there was a pandemic. So I don't know when they'll be able to actually go back and scour archives, assuming that some things haven't been digitized. But yeah, hopefully there'll be something else.
Frank, you want to take us? Oh,
Sorry. Are
George.
you working on anything else, Frank?
I'm sorry?
Are you working on anything now?
I'm beginning to think about working on another project. Yeah.
More
Thank
soon.
Thank you for your very vague answer.
Frank, do you want to take us out? Maybe even read the ending from the last section break on 12. If you don't want spoilers, you can leave now.
The lamp must have gone out while I was dozing. It's dark and quiet. Nobody's crying. Nothing hurts. Somewhere far off in the depths of the darkness, somewhere behind the walls, the gutters are chattering. God, it's thawing. The attic spaces rumble hollowly like cases of huge musical instruments. In the solid crag of this black winter, the first crack must have formed. The colossal blocks of darkness in the bulwark of night unclench and begin to crumble. The darkness streams out like ink through the fissures of winter, sputtering in the gutters and down the drains. God, spring advances. And let me interrupt myself there. I want to talk about the difficulty of translating spring advances, because it was no longer possible to say spring is coming just because of that horrible Game of Thrones, and winter is coming. So I went with advances because of the sort of military language elsewhere. So out there in the world, the city gradually wrests itself from the fetters of darkness. A thaw carves out house after house from the lithic wall of darkness. Oh, to once more seek advice from the dark breasts of the thawing breath. Oh, if only to feel on my face the wind's black damp sails gliding down the streets. The small flickering of the street lamps on the corner blush ablaze and turn blue as the wind's purple sails fly past. Oh, if only to sneak out and escape, to abandon him here all alone forever with his pain everlasting. What base temptations you are whispering in my ear, O thawing zephyr. But in which part of the city does this apartment lie? Where does this shuttered, boarded up window lead? As for myself, I can no longer remember the street where my childhood home was. Oh, if only to peek out through the window, to seek guidance from the thawing breeze. Thank you.
Silent clapping, love it. This is the modern day we live in. Well, everyone, thank you so much again for coming. Catch us on Twitter. Apparently, there's an after party that I didn't know about.
You weren't invited.
Understand. Don't want the boss
Being
in your style.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.